Well, good morning, everybody. And what a lineup to have to follow and finish up on. Thank you for having me here today. And as you probably know, today is September the 18th, or as we say in Australia, only 3 more Prime Ministers till Christmas. My last book was called Why the Future is Workless, and it was about the effects of technology on work. But what I want to say about it first up was that it was dedicated to my son, Noah, not least because I realised that it was his generation who were going to feel the full effects of the technological change that we're going through at the moment. He's actually now a dancer with the Queensland Ballet. So he's managed to rather elegantly sidestep the issue of whether or not a robot will take his job. As he said to me once, "Dad, no one wants to watch a robot dance Swan Lake." That may well be true, but the effects of technology are not really as easy to escape as that. And I'll tell you a little bit about his background because it ties in with what I want to say. His dance career really began about 8 years ago, which was coincidentally around about the same time that I started researching the book. He began training at the Victorian College of the Arts Secondary School when he was in Year 9. And in that program, they do full-time dance, like 6 hours of dance a day, as well as full-time school. So it's quite a rigorous program. After he left school, he trained for 3 years with the Australian Ballet School. And after graduation from that, at the end of last year, he was offered a job with Queensland Ballet, his first professional job. Parenthetically, this means he's living away from home for the first time and he's discovering the joys and otherwise of that. He's sharing a place with some dancers, other dancers from the company, and he spent his first few weeks in Brisbane navigating, as inevitably happens, the local IKEA store. I rang him about a week after the furniture had arrived and he still hadn't got any of it together. As a builder, he's a really excellent dancer. And he never wanted to see another Allen key in his life. He'd already gone through the 5 stages of IKEA: anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and then finally accepting that he needed to ring someone on, or contact someone on Airtasker to put it all together for him, which is one way of being introduced to the gig economy, I guess. Incidentally, at the time all this was happening, you might have heard this story that the guy who founded IKEA died. And I sent Noah the news story about that, and I got a text back, and all it said was he assassinated? Anyway, when Noah first told us that he wanted to audition for VCAS, the College of the Arts School, my wife and I think, had a reaction that a lot of parents would recognise. We were happy for him to pursue dance, but we wondered how practical that might be, how secure, what sort of future it would mean for him. Because here's the thing, nobody may want to watch a robot dance Swan Lake, but dancers still need people with enough disposable income to be able to pay to come along and see them. So, as I told Nora at the time, not even you are immune from the effects of technology. What's more, ballet as a job, as opposed to an art form, is still embedded in certain social and political structures, so that even if the job itself isn't affected by the technology, it is affected by those underlying social and political structures. And all jobs are, and that's the main point that I want to expand on today. That's the angle I want to come at this from. So the topic at hand is the future of work. And when you put it like that, you kind of almost immediately force yourself into the prediction business. And I think that's a real trap. So I want to say at the outset, I left my tarot cards and my crystal ball at home. I'm not going to try and predict anything. But I think it's really important, as Stefan said, that we try and imagine how the world might change so that we might be able to respond to it effectively at a political level. We talk about technological revolutions, how AI or 3D printing will change everything, but then the world we imagine ends up looking pretty much like the one that we're living in now. I actually saw a movie the other day which was set in the future, you know, and everyone was getting around in driverless cars, and they had robots doing the housework and stuff, but then they went off to work and sat down and read a newspaper. My point is that it's hard to break out of certain habits of thinking. Governments pay lip service to the idea that technology will change everything, but then they start talking about jobs and growth as if we were still living in the 60s, where the economy was based on manufacturing, where manufacturing was carried out in factories, employing millions of workers, where the workers were men and where the women stayed at home and looked after the kids. Those days are gone, and in the future they will be even more gone. But the norms of that era, I think, still inform how we think about the future of work. To the extent that we do try and think how tech is changing the job, jobs in general, we tend to do it in really reductive terms. We ask the question, will a robot take my job, as if the answer to that will tell us all we need to know, and it won't. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's a bad question. And it's a bad question because it makes us overly focused on the technology. It makes us expect sudden change when it's more likely that there won't be a single moment after which everything will change. Rather, there will be a series of changes here and there as artificial intelligence becomes a more general technology in the way that electricity once became a general technology. We will apply it to everything and it will change everything, but task by task. So it isn't enough to ask, will a robot take my job? We also need to understand how technologies change underlying social and economic structures. And I can use the example of journalism, I think, to explain what I'm talking about. Media was the first substantial white-collar industry to be affected by the new technologies. Once news could be digitised, the long-established geographical monopolies that underpinned the viability of media companies evaporated. Once that happened, their business model, based on advertising, collapsed. The general result of this has been a loss of jobs, and even where jobs have been retained, a fall in wages and the undermining of the conditions of employment. In fact, since the turn of the century, 200,000 journalists have lost their jobs. Some have found work with new media startups, but most haven't. A lot of those who remain are now freelance in one form or another. The point I'm making is it's not that robots took their jobs, but that the industry in which the jobs were embedded fundamentally changed for both the media organisation as a business and in terms of the way in which journalists work. Pay and conditions changed, and so did the skill set. And as a profession, journalism just happened to be the first cab off the rank. Every other profession, from law to medicine to accounting and banking, is following suit one way or another. And it is the effect of technology on cognitive, white-collar jobs that makes the moment that we're in different. The rule of thumb has always been that if you can write down the rules for a job, then a machine can do it. And that's why many blue-collar factory jobs have already disappeared and are automated. The new rule is, if we have sufficient data and fast enough processing, machine learning and artificial intelligence are likely to be able to do cognitive white-collar jobs as well, or at least many of the tasks of which those jobs consist. This doesn't mean that there won't be new jobs, but that's not the test. The test is, will there be new jobs for millions of people wherever they live that require similar skills to what they have now? And as we've kind of heard already this morning, the answer is probably not. So here's the key point. The technology changes the work that we do, but it's our political system that decides whether such changes will ultimately have a negative or positive effect on our society. If governments take a hands-off approach to the new technologies, we already know that those technologies will put downward pressure on wages and concentrate wealth. They tend to shift income from wages to profits, and we're already seeing such effects. A New York Times article recently noted, the nation's tremendous economic growth has not led to broad social uplift. Economists call it the productivity pay gap, the fact that over the last 40 years, the economy has expanded and corporate profits have risen, but real wages have remained flat for workers without a college education. Since 1973, the article says, American productivity has increased by 77%, but wages have only gone up by 12%. A similar thing is happening in Australia. Economist Jim Stanford wrote recently, workers produce more real output with each hour of labour, thanks to the ongoing efficiency of new technologies, but growth in real wages has been much slower, and recently real wages haven't been growing at all. So let me be clear, robots or some form of technology will either take your job or they'll change it. They will take over some tasks and alter others. They will create new jobs. The question is, though, what will the net effect of these changes be? And there's already reasons to be concerned, I think. James Livingston, American author, points out a job is no longer a guarantee that you will stay out of poverty. He writes, a quarter of adults actually employed in the US are paid wages too low to lift them above the federal poverty line. Once upon a time in America, he says, work was where you learned discipline, initiative, honesty, and self-reliance, in a word, character. It was also the source of your income. Not anymore. Work no longer performs these dual purposes. And to kind of underline that point, here's a statistic to conjure with. 45% of homeless people have a job. Modern technology concentrates wealth, increases surveillance, and damages privacy. It's also going to shift the economic and military power in the world. We've heard a little bit about the rise of China in this respect. The deployment of artificial intelligence will add approximately $15.7 trillion to the global GDP by 2030. $7 trillion of that is going to China, dwarfing the $3.7 million that will go to North America. The four main drivers tipping the balance in China's favour are access to abundant data, entrepreneurs empowered by new tools, growing AI expertise, and mass government funding and support. And that's the bit I kind of want to concentrate on. Of course, the role of the Chinese government in their AI development is an authoritarian model. In our democracies, hopefully we don't want that. And so I think we need to be reinventing government with a bottom-up model of participation. That is, if we want to avoid the dark side of the technology, the side that lets it surveil us and monitor us and erode our conditions of employment, then we need to manage their effects on all these things. Straight regulation is unlikely to be enough, I think. We're going to have to change the way in which some major institutions operate. In the new book that's just come out, I argue the key things we need to do are actually reduce the number of hours that we work, encourage worker ownership of firms, stop relying on wages as our sole source of income and pay what's called a universal basic income, and change the way we elect members of parliament. Let's get really basic here. So let me just run through those in a little bit more detail. Reducing work hours not only helps better distribute work, basically creating more employment, it leads to a safer work environment, better physical and mental health, and it frees up time for other pursuits, including political engagement. Richard Dennis, the economist, says, what is missing from our debates about technological change and job loss is the fundamentally cultural issue of how the benefit of new technologies and the remaining work should be distributed. He says that the way that we've traditionally dealt with this matter in the past is that we work less. So from 1900 to 1970, we did things like created the 8-hour day, the 2-day weekend, paid public holidays and paid annual leave, and they were all part of that. Dennis says, if 1 million people now chose to have a 3-day weekend, the equivalent of 200,000 full-time jobs would be created. But in fact, the technology is tending to increase the amount of time we work. A recent British survey found that the introduction of Wi-Fi on public transport has effectively turned commute time into work time, increasing the length of the unpaid workday. In fact, 54% of Wi-Fi use on public transport is people sending work-related emails. Beyond shorter working hours, worker ownership of firms is the only real way to respond to the increasing concentration of wealth and the suppression of wages. It isn't simply enough to increase wages, though we should do that. Workers need to own the businesses and share in the wealth that they help to create. And to ensure that none of us is ever completely sidelined by technological disruption, we need more than just a safety net. We need a solid floor beneath which we cannot fall. In other words, a universal basic income. But of course, none of this happens, and this is the last point, unless we change the way we are governed. Ultimately, we need a more diverse representation in Parliament, so that politicians stop being mere mouthpieces for vested interest. I would like us to see, and I make this argument in the book, what I call a people's house, where we all get a chance to serve, just as we now do on a jury. Unlike the Senate, a people's house would give the power of review to the entire adult population on a rotating basis. Okay, so robots and other forms of technology are the economic equivalent of slave labour. They are a one-off capital expense, not an ongoing expense. That is, they are cheaper. They are therefore ultimately going to be preferred by any business whose goal is to make a profit. So to compete with them is to accept the logic of the slave. New technology by itself will not save us from the consequences of that. What I'm saying is we need a new politics as well. Now, if any of this sounds like I'm anti-technology, then I'm really giving you the wrong impression. I really am not. I actually believe the technology could liberate us from endless work, appalling conditions, and devoting the majority of our lives to working for the enrichment of others. I agree with Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher, who said, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. In other words, technology can free us up to think about and do other things rather than spending all our time and energy worrying about basic and repetitive tasks. But it only works in everyone's favour if we retain the people, retain control over our workplaces and our government. Last point. Since my book Workless came out about 2 years ago, I've been asked in many public forums one ongoing question, and it often comes from parents who are worried about the future for their kids. And the question they ask me is, what should my kids be doing to prepare themselves for this future? I'm tempted to say ballet. But no, that's not the real answer. My real answer is actually unequivocal. It's become political. Join a party or a union or some other pressure group and force politicians to use these wondrous new technologies to build a world that benefits the many and not just the few. Thank you very much.